webinar on tribal-specific provisions in the final 2018 Farm Bill. I'm going to start by going over a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. So first, if you want to look in your handout section of your control panel, you'll see our full breakdown of all of the 63 tribal-specific provisions in the final Farm Bill. You'll also find today's slideshows that are being presented, and you can download them and keep them for later reference. As a note, we will also post and archive this webinar after its conclusion on our Indigenous Food and Agriculture YouTube channel, as well as our resources library on our website at indigenousfoodandag.com. All attendees will be muted throughout the duration of the presentation, but you can use your control panel to raise your hand or submit a question using the questions dialog box. And at the end of the presentation, we'll have time set aside to answer those questions. So first, I'd like to do a quick introduction of our presenters today and a few members of our IFAI team. First, we have our director, Colby Duran, and we have Aaron Parker, our research director and staff attorney. We have Blake Jackson, our policy officer and staff attorney, and unable to join us today, but is a great resource for any questions. It's Tony Stranger-McLaughlin is our director of tribal governance. So I will go ahead and turn it over to Colby to get started.
All right, good afternoon or good morning, everybody. Thank you very much. That was Whitney Swanee, who's our new communications manager at the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative, who did that introduction. Thank you all very much for joining us on this Native Farm Bill Coalition Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative webinar to talk about the 2018 Farm Bill and some of the different changes that were included for tribal governments and some of the different things that tribes and tribal producers must be looking out for as it moves into the implementation phase. Just to do a quick little introduction to who we are, at the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative, we're part of the University of Arkansas's Office of Economic Development. We were established in 2013 by now Vice Chancellor Stacy Leeds, who's a citizen of Cherokee Nation, and our founding director, Janie Sims Hemp, citizen of Chickasaw Nation. And we're established in the School of Law. From there, we moved when Vice Chancellor Leeds took her position in the Office of Economic Development, and that really helps to continue to promote the mission that the initiative has had since its founding, which is to enhance the health and wellness of tribal communities, advancing healthy food systems, diversified economic development in food and agriculture, and then protecting cultural and traditional food practices throughout Indian country. And really our strongest charge is to try to empower tribal governments and tribal producers in food business and food as economic development. We have a lot of different types of work that we do. Our focus is working with tribal governments and producers to develop tribal food systems, working on federal Indian law and policy, and where that intersects with agricultural law, and trying to be able to answer some of those difficult questions where those two circles come together. And as Whitney introduced, our strong team has a lot of capacity and knowledge and networking relationships. We do also do training and outreach and other expertise, educational materials in there as well too. To get a little bit of an idea of some of the other work that we do in addition to being a research partner on the Native Farm Bill Coalition, we do food safety training and outreach as the Native American Tribal Center for Food Safety, Outreach, Education, Training, and Technical Assistance. That's focused on tribal producers who are engaged in produce production, and so we've been doing training. We're entering our third year of that to do trainings throughout all of Indian country. So please, if you want more information about that, you can visit our website, nativeFoodSafety.org. If you would like to have a training hosted in your community area, please reach out to us that way. We're happy to be able to do that as well. As part of that effort, we're developing an alternative curriculum to hopefully have more culturally appropriate training for the produce safety rule. And so we're working with an alternative curriculum working group team to develop that out. One of our other projects, which was just launched in December of 2018, is a model tribal food and agriculture code, which is available at tribalfoodcode.com. That is something that's been an effort of over 3 years of work trying to develop that out and culminated into a 19-chapter model food and ag code that would hopefully provide the basis for any tribal governments, tribal attorneys that are looking to develop out the tribal departments of agriculture, what are some of the different other regulatory components that would be necessary within that. And that was something that was developed by our team here led by Aaron Parker, and also a lot of consulting attorneys as well too throughout that project. So we're very excited that that resource is out there, and we're doing outreach and training on that as well. So if that's something that your tribe or tribal community is interested in, please contact us. We'd be happy to talk further about what are some of the different components of that. We've done food policy roundtable discussions throughout Indian country. We also support the National Association of Food Distribution Programs on Indian Reservations, or NAFDIPR, or the Commodities Program Food Package. We also have an annual Native Youth in Food and Agriculture Leadership Summit, which is very exciting. It's entering its 6th year, and we'll have the application process for that out this week. So that will be sent out to everybody as well. We have a Scaling Up project, which we're entering our 2nd year in, to be able to help tribal food businesses and tribal governments take that next step in food production. That's something that Blake Jackson's been working on. And what we're here to talk about today is the Native Farm Bill Coalition, and our work as sort of the research partner in all of that. So as a lot of folks who are familiar with, who have been members of the coalition, who have joined our webinars that we've done either the weekly or monthly ones before, know that this effort really started in the beginning of 2017 with the Regaining Our Future report. The Shakopee Metawakan Sioux community and their Seeds of Native Health campaign, throughout a lot of the work that they've been doing to try to help support food and agriculture, traditional foods, and healthy foods throughout Indian country, saw as one of the next steps that they wanted to take was taking a look at what are some of the federal policy implications that need to either have changes or need to be looked at. So they commissioned us at the initiative and our founding director, Janie Sims Hemp, and myself to draft a report. And what ended up in this report is about 140 pages that goes through the entirety of food and agriculture, a little bit of a historical look at it, looks at some of the different opportunities that have existed and efforts that have been done before, and also takes a walk through each one of the 12 titles of at the time, the 2014 Farm Bill, and identify what were some of the changes, what were some of the things that were asked for by tribes or tribal organizations, and what are some additional new opportunities. We did this report in partnership with Intertribal Agriculture Council, whose executive director Ross Racine and Zach Ducheneau have been stalwart voices on the Farm Bill for Indian country for over 30 years, with the National Congress of American Indians, and with the Intertribal Timber Council. So when this report was released in June 2017, and there's a link to it available there, and these slides will be shared so that information will be available. The Native Farm Bill Coalition developed really out of that and started in October 2017 at NCI's annual meeting in Milwaukee. Since that time, over 170 tribes have joined the coalition. 76 have joined either individually directly through resolutions or sending letters of support. 14 intertribal and Native organizations or tribal authorities or businesses have also joined on as well too. And we also have allied organizations who are support, including our friends at Mazone, a Jewish response to hunger, who have been a very strong voice pushing forward some of the anti-hunger messages and supporting some of the changes to help support tribal citizens and tribal governments in the nutrition program, and also our friends at the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition as well. What was really kind of put together by the coalition were some top opportunities. And again, as the report walked through and identified everything in all 12 titles of the bill, there were a lot of themes that were existed throughout. And a lot of that focused on some of the top ones were the Tribal Administration of Nutrition Programs, and that was sort of done through the 638 Tribal Self-Governance Authority. There's a proposal to try to get that in the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. Also to make some improvements to the Food Distribution Program on Indian Reservations, or FDIPR, with a 638 authority, also increasing regional authority, looking at sort of a regional model, improving the ability to get traditional foods in, changing some of the matching requirements as well to allow for better administration and improve administration and support for the program managers that run that. Tribal parity and supporting tribal sovereignty and recognition of tribes as governments, and also supporting tribal self-determination came up in other ways. There's a proposal for 638 for tribal government management of forests. Also looking at opportunities for tribal parity and also tribal producer inclusion in the conservation title, other ways to improve access to credit as well. One of the larger components that USDA does is also its rural development authority as well to build out infrastructure. There has existed since the 2008 Farm Bill, the substantially underserved trust areas designation, which exists under a certain set of rural development programs, and to try to be able to expand that out and make improvements within that. And then also the ability to provide direct technical assistance to tribes and tribal entities that are applying for rural development programs, as access to those programs is something that has been a consistent issue. There's also the looking to try to increase and support access to healthy, traditional, local, and regionally produced food by native farmers and ranchers, and also equal access in the research title, including looking at equality and equal access for tribal colleges and universities, and many of the different funding programs for that as well. So now that we've walked through that title, everyone knows that we have a 2018 Farm Bill. For those that were nice enough to be able to hang on to all of our weekly calls, I think I was surprised just as much as everybody was that this was able to get done. So how do we end up actually getting to where we are? I think it's important because that'll show what some of the shape of the bill looks like and what programs came out of that. So the House started their process first. The House and Senate each do their own. The House and Senate Agriculture Committees each do their own version of the bill. The House passed theirs out on a strict party line vote. It represents just a one vote difference. There was some back and forth about trying to get more support from other members within the majority Republican Party in the House. They were able to do that, pass it out on one vote. They didn't include House Democrats in the development of that bill. The Senate took a different approach, and that's just really a function of the Senate needing 60 votes to get most things done. I guess we can't say everything done now, but getting most things done. They ended up working on their bill, and that passed through the Senate with 86 votes, and at the time that represented the most votes of any farm bill ever. Those two bills had to be put together in a conference committee, and they appointed conferees for both the House and the Senate. The negotiations on those focused mostly on the nutrition, commodity, and conservation titles. And we know that those negotiations were really carried forward by the four principals of the conference committee, which would be the chairs and ranking members of the Senate and House Agriculture Committees, would be Senator Pat Roberts, who's the chair of the Senate Ag, with ranking member Senator Stabenow. On the House side, the chair, Conaway from Texas, and then our ranking member Colin Peterson. All of those four worked together to be able to shape what ended up being the final bill. There was a lot of issues with the nutrition title, having some stark differences, whereas the House included some additional work requirements, some additional changes in conservation and in Title I, and also in the forestry title. The 2018 midterm elections kind of changed the dynamics a little bit. And what really happened with that is it seemed like the discussions to that point really changed to want to be able to get something done. Part of that is that where food and agriculture is right now, with farm income still down about half of where they were when the last farm bill was passed, then some farmers looking at issues of credit. There was also an issue of forestry and wildfire funding issues. At the time, there was that incredibly devastating fire out in California that was doing a significant number of damage, and so there were some issues of looking at trying to be able to solve that process. The wildfire fight was eventually put out and worked out. And then the final farm bill, when it was passed, looked a lot like the Senate version, but also included some nods to what was included in the House bill as well. When the Senate ended up passing it, it passed with 87 votes, which is now the most votes a farm bill has ever gotten in the Senate, and passed through the House with 369 votes. Just overall with the bill, it's when Congress calculates the spending impact of any legislation, it does it over a 10-year period This is an $867 billion bill over that 10-year period. Again, it's a 5-year bill, so it has an expiration date in 5 years. So its actual spending is half of that. But what's important to note is that this doesn't add to the budget deficit at all. That was something that they went into this whole process planning, that this would not impact or change the budget because there were significant cuts in the 2014 Farm Bill to spending. There's increased payments to the commodity title. That was sort of a larger sticking point. Just a quick note on this. With farm incomes being down about half and some issues of farmers being hit by some of the different trade barriers that they're starting to see, a lot of these nods and changes to payments kind of represent ways to be able to provide more liquidity and money available to farmers, so hopefully not have to go down to any other either ways of bankruptcy or a loss of production. So it's a way to try to infuse money within the commodity title payments. The conservation programs were preserved. This looks a little bit more like the House version of the bill. Overall, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program and the Conservation Stewardship Program were, as they're calling it, streamlined. So they're basically put together. So the program is actually under EQIP. So if you were to pull up the law, you would see EQIP. Then the first title of that is EQIP. And then the second title underneath that is EQIP CSP. It actually provided for a change and increase of funding for EQIP. So at in fiscal year 2025, there'll be an increase in EQIP to just a touch over $2 billion. This year for FY19, it's at $1.75 billion. So that number is going to steadily increase. For folks that are interested in the CSP program, that's now being calculated on dollars, not acres anymore, because it is streamlined under EQIP. So that changes a little bit of the function of the program. As I said before, there's no additional changes to the SNAP work requirements. And this also legalizes the production of industrialized hemp in the United States. And we'll talk a little bit about that more in detail. Overall, there are 63 total tribal provisions in 11 of the 12 titles. For transparency's sake, the one that's not included is the energy title. That was probably the slimmest of all the titles, and there wasn't really that much of an ask within that that we put forward. So we'll just take a quick look at here, and here's a slide that that Whitney put together that really represents and shows where all of these 63 provisions are spread across. Some of them are in multiple categories, so I would get familiar with these really cool looking icons because they'll be coming up on the slides. So you'll be able to see that there's 39 provisions of those 63 that have some reference to tribal parity. So 62% of the provisions are focused on parity. There's access to funding provisions, training and infrastructure, technical assistance and outreach, and then provisions that support traditional and native produced food. So a lot of these all work together. Some fit across more, which is why you're seeing the percentages. But this is a really good representation to, I think, visually show what was the impact directly of these 63 tribal-specific provisions. Starting with the commodities title, as I talked about with the larger changes, there were just two changes within the Supplemental Agriculture Disaster Assistance Program. What the first change did was it added tribes and tribal organizations to the definition of an eligible producer for the program, which is something that is a recognition that they hadn't been directly included in before. Additionally, for the tree assistance program, it requires a 75% reimbursement of the losses under a disaster assistance scenario for beginning and veteran farmers and ranchers under that program as well. And to talk about the conservation title, I'm going to turn it over to Erin Parker.
Thank you, Colby. So here in the conservation title, as Colby noted at the beginning of this presentation, one of the top 2018 Farm Bill opportunities that the Native Farm Bill Coalition and the Regaining Our Future report had identified was seeking parity for tribes across all 12 titles of the Farm Bill. And here in the conservation title, we have two big changes that really support tribal parity in the 2018 bill. The first one of which is going to be alternative funding arrangements that support tribal access in our conservation programs. Alternative funding arrangements actually came about in the 2014 bill. The 2014 Farm Bill gave the Secretary of Agriculture some discretionary authority to enter into these arrangements with tribes And it took us until 2017 to get the first tribal nation that actually got an AFA from the USDA, and that was the Gila River Indian community, who got some funding from USDA through an alternative funding arrangement to support some water and irrigation systems. The 2018 bill, after one of the coalition's priorities was improving the implementation of that provision. So the 2018 bill actually does that and provides a little bit more parity for tribes in this instance. It requires the secretary to do this, as opposed to it being a discretionary measure. So this is an exciting change because it's going to allow more full access to two particular important conservation programs that Colby just talked about, EQIP and CFP. Both of those programs are now eligible for alternative funding arrangements that will help tribes do some more conservation. And part of that can include promoting traditional tribal agricultural practices and structures. So that's an exciting change. The next one is the Regional Conservation Partnership Program. The Regional Conservation Partnership Program is an older program. It came about in the 2008 Farm Bill. Basically, it allows access to contracts through NRCS on 4 existing NRCS authorities. I won't walk through all of those right now, just that's basically the way the program works. Tribes have been eligible previously to enter into that program as a partner, but it wasn't until this Farm Bill, the 2018 Farm Bill, that tribes were able to enter into those contracts on their own without being partners with any other kind of entity. So that's another way that we're promoting tribal sovereignty through this Farm Bill and allowing tribes to actually stand on their own and do programs through our CPP. And I think I'm going to turn it over to Blake to run through a few more of the conservation programs.
Thank you, Erin. As Erin alluded to, a big theme in the Farm Bill that was advocated by the Native Farm Bill Coalition is parity. And we continue to see that as we go through the rest of the conservation title, as well as throughout the rest of the bill. The Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program is a subset of the CRP, and it's administered by the FSA, and it targets high priority conservation concerns identified in federal funds or supplemental with non-federal funds to address these concerns. So when you remove environmentally sensitive land from production and establish permanent resource conserving plant species, farmers and ranchers are paid an annual rate along with other federal state incentives as applicable for each CREP agreement. And now this is a voluntary program, and the contract is typically 10 to 15 years. And now we see parity in this provision because tribes, as are recognized by the language in the title, to enter into cost share arrangements as eligible partners to supplement federal funds under these CREP agreements. We see a new measure in the pilot programs, section 2204, and this is with conservation reserve easement. A pilot project that was created here was for 30-year conservation easements called Clean Lakes, Estuaries, and Rivers practices, and these are for short called Clear 30. And we see tribal parity in this provision as it requires the secretary to enter into one or more agreements with tribes under the Clear 30 program. And lastly, the thing I would like to touch on is the Conservation Reserve Program. It's the Transition Incentives Program under Section 2501. And this is an older program as it was established under the 2008 Farm Bill, and it provides an opportunity for a CRP contract holder to receive 2 additional annual rental payments after their contract expires, on the condition that the land is sold or rented to a beginning or socially disadvantaged farmer or rancher who agrees to use sustainable grazing or farming methods as they return the land to production. And it offers a way to create new farming opportunities while continuing conservation efforts on the land. And we see tribal parity exercised through this provision because the language in the 2018 Farm Bill increased appropriations from $33 million to $50 million here, and it included up to $5 million for outreach and technical assistance to facilitate these transfers to the beginning or socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers. And this continues throughout the trade provision as well. We see parity because there are increased opportunities for tribes to access overseas markets. And we see this in the Foreign Trade Missions, section 3312. And this requires the Secretary to seek support for greater inclusion and participation by native farmers, ranchers, and producers on international trade missions. And this title, a specific thing within this title is it requires a report to Congress within 2 years regarding the efforts of the agencies to increase tribal inclusion on international trade missions.
Great. Next to talk about the nutrition title is Erin.
All right, let's get into the nutrition title because there's some really exciting changes in the nutrition title, I think. That, as the slide notes here, support tribal self-governance, especially through the management of the food distribution program on Indian reservations, or FDIPR, or the commodities program, as it's sometimes known. So the first provision that's in here that you can see directly supporting parity and also traditional foods potentially and local native grown foods is going to be this 638 tribal self-determination contract procurement provision for FDIPR foods, the actual foods that go into the food packages. Before this farm bill, before the 2018 farm bill, there was no 638 self-determination contract or compact authority for any USDA program, not even the potential for it. This law has really been a sea change on that. We've got two different provisions. We'll talk about forestry a little bit later with Blake. There's also a 638 component in that title. But here in the nutrition title, we've got a possibility for some 638 authority for tribes to actually do some food purchasing and be more involved in sourcing and procuring the foods that go into the food distribution program packages that help support and feed some of the most vulnerable people in tribal communities across the country. FDIPR serves a large number of elders, a large number of children. 42% of FDIPR households have someone over the age of 60, for example. So this could be a really important opportunity for tribes to exercise some self-governance authority. It is worth noting, though, that while the Farm Bill did authorize this change, and it authorized $5 million to allow one or more tribes to enter into these contracts over the next several years, unfortunately, currently it's not funded, so it will require an appropriation and a separate piece of legislation from Congress to actually put that $5 million on the ground and let USDA pick it up and start doing some implementation on it. So we're still waiting to see for appropriations on that $5 million, but stay tuned. Hopefully, once that gets funded, we can see some more opportunities through this provision for tribes to actually do some sourcing of food, which can lead to some economic development opportunities for local native producers and other local and regional producers who are growing or producing food that might be able to be sourced into this program. There are a lot of other changes that were made to FDIPR in the nutrition title, as you can see here, that a lot of these have come up in tribal consultation with tribal leaders, specifically on the FDIPR with USDA over the last several years. The National Association of Food Distribution Programs Board was very instrumental in surfacing up some of these potential opportunities because they've been actually on the ground managing Indian tribal organizations that administer the FDIPR for almost, in some cases, more than 30 years. And so they know this program inside and out. Some of these things were changes that they'd identified and tribal leadership had identified as ways that would improve the functionality of the program and service of the program to the people who really need it every single month to make sure that their nutritional needs are met. And that includes lowering the tribal match requirement. Prior to this farm bill, the tribal match requirement was 25%. That's been changed. It's now 20% thanks to the 2018 Farm Bill. There's also a specific waiver of the match requirement and a full funding required for tribes that have economic hardship. The Farm Bill also makes it explicitly clear that USDA is not able to lower any administrative funding for any tribe that has that match waived. So if you get a waiver of your match, the USDA cannot lower by law the administrative funding you receive because that wouldn't amount to a match at all. So that's a change that's in the law here for FDIPR. Another one is 2-year carryover funding. That was actually authorized in 2017 in a different piece of legislation, but this Farm Bill has made it permanent. And that's going to allow ITOs across the country who administer this program to have a little bit more flexibility in their administrative funding and hopefully let them make some really, really necessary infrastructure changes to their warehouses and allow them to serve people better through the program. A couple other changes here, just really quick. Regionally grown has been added to the traditional foods provision, purchasing part for FDIPR, and the secretary is required to purchase traditional foods if they can be procured cost effectively. There are 4 traditional foods in the program right now: salmon, wild rice, bison, and blue cornmeal. I know the FDIPR Food Package Review Working Group and USDA are working on also sourcing catfish. as another traditional food. So hopefully with provisions like this, we'll see the ability of USDA and tribes to work together to put more traditional foods into that package so that there's more regional representation and more culturally appropriate foods available for everybody in the program. A couple of other things before I turn this back over to Colby to walk through some more of the titles. There are two more changes made in the nutrition title that potentially increase access to some funding and also some parity for tribes. There's some micro grants for food security that you can see here on the slide. It's up to $5,000 for individuals and $10,000 for other entities. This includes tribes and tribal organizations. Really specifically, Alaska is on the list of micro grants for food security in this particular provision. So that's a good opportunity to improve food security in some of our Alaska Native communities. And finally, the nutrition title changed the name of the FINI program, or the Food Insecurity Nutrition Incentives Program, honoring Gus Schumacher, a longstanding food justice and farm programs advocate. And this author also made some microloans available for local foods. If you may be familiar with FINI under another name, we usually think about it as Double Up Snap Bucks. So if you're familiar with that program, that's the change that was made here, is just renaming the program, changing a little bit of authorizing microloans for local foods in this program and making tribes eligible. So again, we see that parity component of the 2018 Farm Bill here. And I will turn it back over to Colby.
Thank you, Erin. As you can see, there were a ton of changes in nutrition, and a lot of this is really centered around just the strength of the tribal leaders coming together, talking about the importance of 638 and tribal self-governance within this. And there was also progress move forward in this as well too, as there was a bill that was actually introduced on the Senate side that would have tribal self-governance as a supplemental nutrition assistance program, or SNAP, which is hopefully a great way to start the conversation as we're building into the, I guess it would be the 2023 Farm Bill.
Right.
Although it's hard to look, I guess, that far ahead when you have a brand new one as well. So the next title, credit. Within the credit title, there was one change in it. There was a Government Accountability Office, or GAO, study on access to the farm credit system for Indian country. This isn't maybe the GAO study on credit that was put forward directly by the coalition, but ends up being hopefully something that will be very helpful. The farm credit system, for folks that don't know, represents a congressionally chartered agriculture lender of groups of both associations that are regionally located in various different areas, and also cooperative banks that do lending on infrastructure as well too. We have a good working relationship with the folks at Farm Credit. With this GAO study has already started underway. We know the GAO is reaching out to people, doing interviews on that as well too. And I think the target date I heard for this was April 2019 is when they're going to try to have this out. They're supposed to have it done within 90 days. The government shutdown, I think, with the government shutdown, I think they're giving them a little bit more of a cushion. So we know that this is something that's going to be out there, but hopefully this will give some good information and background on ways to help further and support credit access for tribal producers and tribes in the farm credit system. And then also might be looking at some of the other issues that exist in both the private lending systems as well too. Going on to the rural development titles that we alluded to before, one of the larger inclusions in this is the establishment of a technical assistance program, which is sits across and looks at all the different rural development agencies, but will hopefully provide an important conduit in place for tribal entities that are trying to apply for rural development programs. And those are the infrastructure programs that can be built, building community services, telecommunications, broadband, water, sewer, electric, roads, all of those types of hard infrastructure, housing, community facilities programs, to have a place to have those different types of questions asked for, and to be able to try to get some additional support. One of the things that we've seen is that there has been some miscommunication between folks and between folks at RD and tribes, and hopefully this will provide a very important technical assistance touch point to help support tribes that are applying for these programs as well. We talked about the substantially underserved trust areas designation, or SUDA designation. SUDA itself as an entity wasn't able to be applied across all of rural development, but this bill did take a very important step, and it provides a refinancing authority for the different programs that are eligible for students. And why this is important is that USDA, when they would do loans under this, just like any other bank would do, they didn't have the statutory authority to refinance a loan. So over a 30 or 40-year infrastructure loan, circumstances change for everybody within that time period. So if there were any issues with having the payments needing to be changed, the structure paid, the amounts changed, the USDA just did not have the ability, like any other banker would, to make those types of changes. Now, with this refinancing authority, this is a very important change because we know this is something that has come up in other contexts to allow for more flexibility in the program and hopefully provide more inclusion within these infrastructure programs as well. There's also additional tribal priority and inclusion to access to 2 broadband programs to help build out that infrastructure, as well as some of the economic development opportunities. This bill increased broadband spending from $25 million to $325 million. Within those 2 pots of money are included for tribal priority, including the eConnect program as well too. So these are important ways to be able to try to get some of the broadband built out, particularly in a lot of rural tribal areas where we know that the last time the FCC looked at this, about 68 to 70% of rural tribal areas lack access to consistent broadband. So hopefully these type of programs will help build up that as well. And then for the Title VII on research, I'm going to hand it back over to Erin.
Sure. Thank you, Colby. So here in the research title, we see inclusion and parity. For our tribal colleges and universities, we've added 2 new TCUs to the TCU roster with this Farm Bill. Red Lake Nation Tribal College and Nueda Sasanish Tribal College, both of those are now recognized as 1994s, thanks to the 2018 Farm Bill. We've also created it's called the New Beginnings for Tribal Students. It's a student scholarship fund to support tribal students who are attending land-grant universities and colleges. And we've made some changes in the Smith-Lieber Act that allow for tribal colleges and universities to be included in a program called the Children, Youth, and Families at Risk program. CYSAR has been in existence since 1991, I think, but TCUs are just now eligible for this program based on the changes that were made in this Farm Bill. This is a program that really supports families with young children, trying to make sure that children are supported and have access to educational resources and have some learning opportunities. So this is going to be a good change for our tribal colleges and universities to be able to access that particular program. And of course, it also makes TCUs eligible for FERPA, as well as changing the McIntyre Stennis Forestry program capacity funding with some research funding for forestry programs that TCUs have not been eligible for before this Farm Bill. So again, that's another way to include and provide parity for tribes to allow tribes to participate fully in these research programs, especially considering how much forestry really supports a lot of industry and economic development for so many tribes across the country. So I think that provides probably a pretty good segue into forestry. So I will turn it over to Blake.
Thanks, Erin. So just to kind of paint the picture, forestry is a really especially important title for Indian country because 18.6 million acres of the 57 million acres of tribal trust land consist of forestry in the United States. And if you want to translate that, that translates to about roughly a third. So just to kind of overlay that, these are some significant achievements for Indian country. The first section we see is the 638 demonstration project, which is in section 8703. So just a little bit of background. The Tribal Forest Protection Act of 2004 authorized both the Secretaries of Agriculture and Interior to enter into contracts with tribes to carry out projects proposed by the tribe on either Forest Service or BLM managed lands if those lands were either bordering or adjacent to Indian lands and the conditions on those lands proposed some sort of kind of threat to the tribal lands that were abutting it, you know, whether that be a fire, disease, or invasive species, or if that land was in need of restoration. And so the 2018 Farm Bill expands on this by allowing these agreements to take the form of 638 contracts, where the tribe may perform itself the administrative management, other functions previously not permitted by the Tribal Forest Protection Act. But the one thing here that is noteworthy is that the Secretary still retained the authority for environmental approvals and other approvals necessary to be exercised by the federal government under existing law. And another provision that was significant for Indian country was Section 8624, which is the Good Neighbor Authority section. As originally passed, the Good Neighbor Authority allowed for the Forest Service to enter into cooperative agreements or contracts with the states and with Puerto Rico to allow them to perform watershed restoration and forest management services on National Forest System lands. And so the 2018 Farm Bill expanded upon this by recognizing tribal parity and extended these provisions to Indian tribes, putting them both on equal footing with the states and with Puerto Rico as was previously authorized. So two big achievements for Indian country here within this title. And so next, a very big provision within the horticulture title is the legalization of industrial hemp. And so before I get going, I did want to note that we do have some decision tools and handouts available to you in the linked presentation over in the right-hand column if you would like to utilize those after our discussion today. So the legalization of industrial hemp was big because hemp was previously included under the definition of marijuana due to the previous kind of politics surrounding the situation. And because of kind of the association of the two plants, even though they have a relation under the cannabis variety, there are two distinct plants. And so this kind of clarified a pathway for the production of industrial hemp if it met the certain definitions. Namely, it has to be less than 0.3% on a dry weight basis with its THC content. And so if this definition is met, then the provisions of the Farm Bill can be utilized going forward. But if not, it's still illegal as marijuana under the Controlled Substances Act. And so for a tribe or a state to assume regulatory authority of on-reservation hemp production, they must first submit a plan to the Secretary with these requirements. Just to kind of touch through them briefly, kind of maintaining the land records, laying out the testing procedures, disposing of plants that don't meet the definition of hemp, requiring the USDA to receive certain information from the tribe within 30 days, laying out kind of how the tribe is going to conduct random inspections and sampling. And the tribe here, this is kind of noteworthy, that the tribe has to attest that it has the sufficient resources and personnel to ensure that it can maintain compliance with the plan that it tells the USDA that it will how it will regulate hemp. So that's a pretty big thing going forward. And under the Farm Bill, there's a provision in there that technical assistance may be available to assist with drafting of these plans. So once this plan has been drafted, it has to be submitted to the Secretary of Agriculture. And within 60 days, the Secretary has to either approve or deny the plan. But a key requirement here is that the Secretary has to confer with the Attorney General, and that's an affirmative requirement. So you don't see any language in here that says if you don't hear back, it's deemed approved. That's the federal meeting those legal requirements that were laid out. And if you're denied, you do get another bite at the apple by resubmitting the plan with what USDA suggested that you fix. And so once that's done, you are able to assume the on-reservation regulatory authority. But the instance is, you have to comply with the plan that you submit. And if you do comply, you don't run into any issues. But if you run into some issues, the Secretary will allow you to perform corrective action on the first instance. But if there are continued violations, you might actually have your authority revoked, and the federal government will come in and assume the regulatory authority, as it would if you didn't submit a plan going forward. And now there are a couple of other things to touch on here. One is that the provision does not have any money tied to it, so it does authorize appropriations to be made as necessary to carry out the title. So we do need a follow-up measure from Congress in getting appropriations bill passed. And secondly, that it does have a a provision there requiring expeditious implementation of regulations by the Secretary. And the best guess as to now is that this is going to be housed in the Agricultural Marketing Service within the USDA, as it does amend the Agricultural Marketing Act. And lastly, an important provision is that there are interstate commerce protections, and you can find those in section 10.114 of the Farm Bill. And those expressly protect the transportation and shipment of industrial hemp within interstate commerce. So if you're going across a jurisdiction to ship your product where it's not legal for hemp, it's always got these protections if it's sourced from a place that the production was legal. And so I think that touches most of the provisions going forward.
Okay, great. Thanks, Blake. The next title, and I know there's a bunch of questions popping up about some of these things as we're getting very close to walking through all 12 of the titles in just about an hour, which quite frankly isn't too bad. We'll hold those questions to the end, and then we'll talk through some of those as well. But in the crop insurance title, Title 11, there's a report that USDA and RMA consistently has to do regarding underserved producers for crop insurance. Tribal producers are now explicitly included in that definition of it, and are going to be included in that report of whether the crop insurance programs are providing the necessary coverage for those producers. So that's an important change. And I think one of the things I'll also mention for folks that are looking to do hemp production, this was included in the hemp provision, but there's also crop insurance available for hemp as well too within this Farm Bill. In the miscellaneous title, the miscellaneous title, because if 11 titles weren't enough, there's a lot of different programs that cut across all of those things, or sometimes just need to have their own place to be parked. One of the discussions going forward was trying to help support the Office of Tribal Relations. The Office of Tribal Relations was made a permanent fixture within the Office of the Secretary in the 2014 Farm Bill. There was, and that was included a direct report to the Secretary of Agriculture and to advise them on policy and issues within tribal agriculture. This direct relationship was maintained in there. There was some language in the House bill that would have merged the Office of Tribal Relations into some other outreach functions that USDA does. So one of the concerns that happened with this and was voiced very strongly by tribal leaders, particularly at a tribal consultation listening session in October 2017, was that this type of change does not represent the government-to-government relationship or the trust responsibility. One of the things that we saw happen was that USDA made it very clear in their organization chart where OTR sat, as well as that has its true function in the direct line to the Office of the Secretary. And that was included in manager's language, recognizing that the Office of Tribal Relations needs to have a direct report to the Secretary, particularly on policy issues. So that was a very important recognition and maintaining of the Office of Tribal Relations. And for folks on the phone that want to know who's in charge of that, Diane Kulo is the director of the Office of Tribal Relations and is doing a lot of really great stuff, particularly on trying to help out some of the different outreaches USDA is going into the implementation phase. So we'll talk a little bit about that later.
So a couple of other changes in the miscellaneous title. This is again an area where we see parity in this title, and parity often, one of the reasons that was identified by the Native Farm Bill Coalition as such a priority and opportunity for Indian country in the 2018 Farm Bill was because it often adding tribes and making tribes explicitly eligible for different programs within USDA opens up additional funding opportunities for tribes and tribal producers. And here we see that with the PHOTO program. It's the Farming Opportunities Training and Outreach Program, commonly known as PHOTO, and that's a program for beginning and socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers. This particular change in the 2018 Farm Bill is going to provide additional tribal government and producers some eligibility for this program. So again, we see like parity being combined with greater access to funding through this particular change. We've also, in this Farm Bill, codified the tribal promise zone existence. Basically what this does, If you're familiar with promise zones, those were created by the previous presidential administration, President Obama's administration. There were several tribal areas that were designated as promise zones. And what that allows tribes to do is to really increase and strengthen their employment opportunities, their through tribal corporations, expand educational opportunities, improve housing access within the tribal community. All of those things have been codified, the ability of federal agencies to continue to recognize those, even though the previous administration had created them, that has been codified by this Farm Bill. So federal agencies are still required to now, under this Farm Bill, continue to provide those resources and technical assistance for areas that have been designated tribal promise zones. There was a provision in, I believe, the Senate version of the bill that would have included some competitive enhancement provisions. Unfortunately, that wasn't included in the final portion of the bill, but what was included was this continued recognition by federal agencies of tribal promise zones.
Great. And then the last one to touch on, just point this out, is the Tribal Advisory Committee. So there's a new Tribal Advisory Committee that was established by this bill. There had previously been one that was created under the Keep-Siegel litigation. That has expired. So this is a recognition that there needs to be some type of continuous Tribal Advisory Committee that advises the Secretary on issues of agriculture in Indian country, and particularly focus on different policies and access to programs. The Office of Tribal Relations is supporting the Secretary of Agriculture on this. For folks that are familiar with the Treasury Tribal Advisory Committee that was created as part of the General Welfare Exclusion Act in 2013. This structure looks very similar to that. That is marginally intentional from Congress, because I think it was one of the last congressionally created advisory committees. So to have that kind of breakdown, and you can see we put together this chart that Blake put together on here, but there's 3 members that are appointed by the Secretary, 2 members appointed by Senate Committee on Indian Affairs. So the chair and vice chair each get their own appointment. 2 committee members appointed by Senate Committee on Ag. Again, that the ranking and chair each get their own. And then 4 members in the House Agriculture Committee, and the ranking and chair each get 2 appointments. How that process goes forward will hopefully become clear. The Secretary has to start to develop this out. This is something that is an important thing to keep in mind as we're getting into implementation. But this is an important way to have a continuous and consistent representation of tribal voices to advise the Secretary directly. In addition to this, a member of the Office of Tribal Relations, and also someone who represents the Assistant Secretary of Indian Affairs at the Department of the Interior, also needs to be at each one of the meetings of these. So this will hopefully be a really good way to allow for cross-agency dialogue between USDA and the Department of Interior, as so many tribal agriculture issues get sometimes tied and bogged down into land and trust land issues that exist at the Department of Interior. So hopefully this will be a strong cross-communication to allow these issues to become addressed or to solve them as they come up. So I guess with that, we'll pause and answer some questions regarding some of the different provisions, because that was a lot of information to walk through within the hour. So for everyone who might just went, wow, that was a lot of information. It was more than I wanted to know, but I'm really glad to have heard it. We'll be providing a copy of the slides for that. Those are actually in the handout section of the toolbar, so you can download those too, but we'll be emailing them out to everybody along with some of the other additional tools. So you'll have access to those too, so you can go back. One of the first questions we have is about the eligibility requirements for trust land management and leasing timelines, and merging those up with the EQIP program. So that was something, if I'm reading this question correctly, that was something that was taken care of in the 2014 Farm Bill that adjusted the leasing requirements for land. For a lot of the folks who may not be familiar, sometimes Bureau of Indian Affairs only allows for a 25-year lease, which would also account for only allowing for a 25-year easement on a piece of land. For most conservation practices under EQIP or even CSP, you're required to get a 30-year easement. So just the numbers didn't match up. That's something that's been addressed. So hopefully those access issues that existed before have been taken care of, and hopefully the increased access to those conservation programs that Aaron talked about, particularly with alternative funding arrangements, will address some of those other issues of trust land management within that. Is bison considered not to be procured cost effectively? This goes back to the nutrition title change. I don't think this is what the intent of it was. I think it was trying to find additional language of trying to maximize the amount of money that goes towards food purchases for it.
Yeah, I agree with Colby on that one, and that's a good question to bring up. And this is about for anybody who just tuned in, there was a change made in the nutrition title in the 2018 Farm Bill that requires the Secretary of Agriculture to purchase traditional foods for the food distribution program on Indian reservations if it can be done cost effectively. I don't think that this is a point to bison not being procured cost effectively. I agree with Colby. I think this is intended to hopefully facilitate broader sourcing of traditional foods for this program, with the recognition that sometimes those foods, where they're available in the commercial marketplace today, typically fetch a higher price point because they're a niche market. So it may be harder to source than other foods, just because there are fewer of them available on the market, and the native growers who are growing those foods are seeking a higher price point for them as a result, which is great for economic development for those communities and those producers. But I think that's kind of a balancing act that's going on there in the law.
Great. The next one we have is about the micro, and this is the micro grant program. So sorry if there's loan in there for micro grant program. That money does go through the states. So that was a question about ensuring money goes to tribes and tribal organizations, or the money going directly to the state. This is the issue that consistently exists. So, with the requirement that those are eligible entities, hopefully the ones that apply that do meet it will be able to get that funding. I think that's something to keep an eye out for. So that's a really good question to ask. In the research title, there is a student scholarship program. The New Beginnings was also called the Wakini Initiative. There's going to be regulations that come out regarding this, and part of this is that university, state land grant institutions that want to do this are going to have to provide a match for the funding that they're going to want. That match can also be in kind, so there's going to be regulations regarding what that process looks like. Regarding eligibility for student scholarships, it would probably have to be, that would be something that would probably be determined by the regulations, but then also by the institutions themselves, and probably would follow along just what their application processes and requirements are already. So that's something that we know will be coming out as well. So that program will hopefully be coming. We've got some questions on hemp. And we've put together the framework for hemp that they put together that's on there. That's the decision tool and some of the background information for it. We'll be producing some more information on hemp as it's coming forward. One thing in the beginning, we talked about some of the other work in our Model Tribal Food and Agriculture Code that Aaron led the work on for. There is a industrialized hemp code within that we're currently working on and revising. So and that was included intentionally with an eye towards industrial hemp was going to be legal when Congress passed this Farm Bill. Looking at what's in it now, we're updating that with it too. That's a research that's already available. Just know that that's in update process as well. So we're going to be looking at what are some of the different frameworks that you might be able to need to try to have a tribal hemp plan. But I think a lot of the details in this will be in the regulations that come out of USDA. The state of Kentucky has already submitted their hemp plan. If it sounds like collusion, because it was done the same day that Farm Bill was passed, it might have been. But we know this was something that was driven by the state of Kentucky, so they were ready to go and to have everything set forward. So it'd be interesting to see what happens with that. We know that there are a lot of tribes that are interested in developing out their own as well. There are only 4 tribal promise zones right now. I don't think this bill expands the ability to get any more of those as well. Going to the next. We got a question about 638 and the Tribal Forestry Protection Act. For tribes that don't currently do 638 contracting and compacting authority, would they be able to do it under the Tribal Forest Protection Act? I think that they would. There's no requirement that you'd have to be doing it, although it would require entering into that type of agreement and negotiation. So that might be a good way, because this is a demonstration project, to see how that rolls out. This is the first time USDA is doing it, first time Forest Service is doing it. Although a lot of these type of agreements would look a lot like cooperative management agreements that already exist between Forest Service and a lot of different tribes. So it would just provide a different authority. So that may not be something that would immediately keep you out of it. Our friend Carla General asked about how will retail sales of CBD on reservation be regulated?
I can jump in on that a little bit. So when the Farm Bill is passed, if you kind of look through some of the language, you'll see at the end that the federal government has reserved the authority for the FDA commissioner to continue to regulate under the Food, Drugs, and Cosmetics Act. So what that translates into is that, okay, so say you don't meet the definition of hemp within the title for industrial uses, it can still be regulated as a food product and as a drug within the FDA. And so I would assume that the way that would be regulated on reservation would be the same as it would with regard to CBD and any other products in food with some of those components elsewhere. And so, you know, and I've been kind of reading up on this a little bit. And the one thing that I will note is, you know, under federal law, under the FDCA, you can get an exemption for a product if it was being marketed as a dietary supplement or as a food product before it was being investigated in clinical trials and drug studies. And the problem with that is the CBD. The FDA has concluded that wasn't the case with CBD products. And there's actually a couple of drugs that FDA has approved with CBD in them. And so that kind of threatens the status, because since there's already a couple of FDA approved drugs on the market, the FDA does still occupy that space of enforcing its own food and drug laws against this. And from what I'm seeing, they look at it more as a drug because there already has been a couple of drugs approved in that space. So while there might not be enforcing to the extent that they're allowed to by law due to, you know, resource constraints or enforcement discretion, whatever they're exercising there, that those products are not fully legalized under the Farm Bill, as that authority remains with the FDA Commission.
So there's still a lot to be able to work out with that. Thanks for that, Blake. As far as inclusion of wild salmon that tribes catch within the FDIPR program, trying to be able to get those included within that.
What's the specific question?
Trying to be able to get wild-caught salmon that tribes catch to be able to be purchased for the FDIPR program.
It may depend on where it's caught. I know there's some jurisdictional complexities, especially if you're looking at Alaska. I don't know about through the FDIPR program specifically. If you generally the way that you get food into the FDIPR program is that you have to go through what's called a vendor certification process. And that allows you to sell food to USDA, not just to the FDIPR program, but to all of the commodity programs that USDA sources from. The agency that runs that program is the Agricultural Marketing Service, AMS, within USDA. So what would need to happen is that anybody who's interested in doing that would need to become a USDA certified vendor. You have to walk through, it can be a pretty detailed process. You have to provide a lot of documentation on the food that you're doing. The big barrier there is going to be sales. If it's wild caught, it's going to depend on what your revenue stream looks like.
And if you need specific technical assistance on that, I'm not sure who's asking that particular question, but you might reach out to us separately if you're interested in becoming USDA vendor certified, because we can kind of talk a little bit maybe separately about what that process looks like and what some of the barriers might be based on the specific situation that you're in, because a lot of it may turn on where you're sourcing your food, and some of it is going to turn on when particular things are, when particular procurement contracts are put out by USDA. And I think, Joe, if that's your question, I know you're very familiar with the inner workings of the food package review work group and what it takes to get a procurement contract out through AMS working with SNS on that particular issue. And I know there is already some salmon in the program. I believe some of that may be already wild caught. So there may be precedent for that. Getting more into the program may require looking at USDA and seeing what funds are available to continue to purchase more of that particular food.
No, yeah, I think so too. And there is some wild salmon caught in there, wild caught salmon included in the FDIPA program, but it does have some. It has to go through that whole process.
You still have to go through the vendor certification process. That would be, if you're looking at trying to donate it as a traditional food in a public facility through Section 4203 of the Farm Bill, that wouldn't be going through FDIPA, but that would be another way potentially to get some traditional foods like wild-caught salmon into public and nonprofit facilities. And this Farm Bill did expand upon that provision that was passed in the 2014 Farm Bill that allowed donation and service of traditional foods into public facilities. State, county, and local education programs are now eligible to receive those food donations in this program, which hopefully, I know a lot of tribes had an issue after the 2014 Farm Bill with county or local ed programs that were outside of the tribal jurisdiction wanting to receive those foods and not being able to do it because that change hadn't been made in the law. Hopefully now with this change, that will enhance the ability of people to get more traditional foods into facilities, whether they're on or within tribal jurisdictional boundaries or without, if they're a public state, county, or local ed program.
Thanks, Erin. So the next question about using specialty crop funds for traditional foods. So this would be the place within the horticulture title. Specialty crop funding does have some application for traditional foods as well too. And one thing to be able to look at is the local access market program, which has some additional inclusion for tribal producers within that. So that provides some assistance and support to be able to get producers within access to those different types of markets as well. So I think that's something that can definitely be looked at as well too. The next, if there's any more to add on that. The next question is about technical assistance available to tribes developing a tribal plan. So that is included within the statutory language of it. I think that's something that's going to have to be rolled out by USDA. So as far as getting USDA technical assistance regarding develop that, that's something that I think is needs to be will be seen in the regulations when they come out. The next question on hemp, does the regulatory authority of tribes over hemp production cover processing and distribution, including wholesale and retail?
That's the way that it's laid out in the plan, it doesn't necessarily provide for that. But the thing is to know about the way you can submit your plan, that is the floor and is not the ceiling. So one strategy could be to implement any laws or regulations that the tribe would like to implement regarding that as part of the submission of the plan to USDA. That way, once that plan is approved, then all the associated tribal authority for that would also be deemed, I guess, approved by the USDA when they approve the plan, as that is incorporated into the larger document. But those channels would still, I would say, be within the purview of the tribe to do that as an on-reservation matter of regulating commerce, because these products would be allowed within commerce if they're done according to the legal definition of hemp in the Farm Bill.
The next question is asking to explain a little bit more about the CSP Transition Incentive Program.
Okay, so the way that the CSP Transition Incentives Program is so if you have a conservation reserve, if your lands are enrolled in the conservation reserve program, you're taking it out of agricultural production and receiving a payment from USDA for, basically taking your land out of commission and letting, preserving the environmental conditions thereon. So if your contract expires, the way that the Conservation Reserve Program, Transition Incentives Program is set up, say when that program ends, when the contract ends, you can get an additional 2-year term on that if you, agree to transition that land over to a beginning or socially disadvantaged farmer or rancher who has also agreed to, implement sustainable practices, and that could be farming or grazing methods when they return the land to the production later on. And so that's one way of kind of how CRP is being implemented. And there is existing information out there on this program, but one thing within the Farm Bill that it did was it used to be for those who are retiring or producers or farmers, but the way that the statute has been amended is that it can be done not only by retiring farmers or ranchers, but with any current contract holder is the new language in the statute for the CRP Transition Incentives Program. So if you have a contract that is expiring, that might be worth looking into with USDA and seeing what kind of on-the-ground assistance is available in doing that.
Thank you, Blake. The next question is about the eConnect program. One of the things that is included in here is that there are some changes to the eConnectivity program. A lot of it is inclusion for more money. It actually fully codifies that program in law now. And there is some tribal priority and recognition of tribal access to that program just because of the rural focus of it for it. So there are some changes in that. But we'll be putting out some more materials on the Farm Bill and some of these specific programs, and broadband ones are particularly ones that are of particular interest as well. We will try to have these up as soon as we'll try to have this webinar up as soon as we can. We've gotten a lot of questions about that as well too. So the next question, there are value-added product provisions in the Farm Bill as well too. There weren't too many changes directly to those in this Farm Bill. Another question regarding 638 agreements by USDA. Someone's asked if those are if those would be done directly by by USDA itself, and so if you have like an existing one with the Department of the Interior or with Indian Health Service, those probably won't be impacted, or you wouldn't have to go through either of those two other agencies to get one at USDA. Those are both demonstration projects. I think it's important to note out. So this is the first time USDA is doing this, so they might be looking at what the existing 638 structures and programs are. So those are important. That's important to keep in mind. But having one in one or the other wouldn't probably be a bar. You wouldn't have to go through Interior for that as well. For the TFPA, for the 638 for TFPA, none of the requirements that existed in the Tribal Forest Protection Act changed. So the requirements of the eligibility for tribal eligibility and the eligibility for trust land all stay the same. That those type of 638 contracts can happen on Forest Service land and Bureau of Land Management land. And so those are activities that can be worked out within those 638 contracts. To be able to start the 638 process for it, and as Aaron talked about with the nutrition title 638 for FDIPR, that needs appropriations. And so the appropriation cycle starting, assuming the government continues to be funded past next week, the appropriations process should be going forward in the committee. So now is a really great time to not go talk only to your senators and representatives, but also start talking to members of the Appropriations Committee within agriculture, because for that demonstration project to happen, Congress has to specifically allocate $5 million for it. Yeah. Then we have another question about, does the heirs property change provision have any particular inclusion for or implications for tribes or tribal producers?
I can try to talk about this a little bit. So the Farm Bill looks at heirs property in particular, and heirs property, if you're not familiar with what heirs property is, just for everybody, heirs property is a feature that largely affects a feature. I call it it's definitely a bug and not a feature. It affects primarily Black farmers in the United States. It's a fractionated land problem that typically affects Black farmers, and many people who weren't able, for example, to have a will probated or to have a will when they passed. When the court probated their will, they split interest between all of that person's heirs, and then that person's heirs and that person's heir, and on and on and on until, as we see a lot with fractionation in land in Indian country, you can have 1,000 owners of one particular piece of land, which makes it very difficult, obviously, to do any kind of agricultural production or use that land for collateral on lending for agriculture or anything like that. Again, this is something that really, when we're talking about heirs property specifically, we're talking about something that primarily affects Black farmers. I don't have any data in front of me talking about how that might impact tribal producers. The change that's in the Farm Bill, there's a couple of changes in the Farm Bill for heirs property. The Senate had an amendment that the Farm Bill ultimately adopted, talking about states that have adopted the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act, which actually allows people to do or to address some of the problems of heirs property. There's provisions in there about that, and specifically, there's also a provision that allowed for people operating on heirs property to get a farm number so that they can access programs offered by Farm Service Agency, NRCS, Risk Management Agency, all those programs at USDA that really help farmers and ranchers be successful. If you were operating on heirs property previously, you weren't able to get a farm number and access those. So if there are people who are tribal producers who do have heirs property or are trying to operate on heirs property, that may be a change that's going to be positive for them. I would suggest some outside resources for folks that we work with. If you're dealing with heirs property issues, there are legal resources out there to help you deal with those issues and maintain your land so you don't lose them. The Land Loss Prevention Project, this is led by Savvy Horn out of North Carolina, is a really great resource to deal with heirs property issues. There's also the Center for Heirs Property Preservation. Both of those organizations are great legal resources for anybody who's dealing with this.
Great. Thank you, Erin. We'll move on to just the last couple of things that we have. So we've talked a little bit about this throughout, and thank you to all of us for hanging on for about 80 minutes so far. But it was with a lot of these great questions, we wanted to make sure to address these questions about the provisions while they were fresh, and everyone was mindful for walking through them. But and this incredible effort to get 63 provisions in there. One of the biggest and most important parts of any different type of effort like this is implementation. And you can kind of think about it like this way: with the legislative efforts, about 49% of it, but the implementation is that 51% that gets you over. Because all these provisions that we talked about, without the funding, without the regulatory component working in there, without the sort of involvement and buy-in from the department itself, won't end up happening. So one of the things that was done and that the tribal leaders and members of the coalition have done throughout is to continue to work with USDA and keep those informed. We know that USDA is very interested in doing tribal consultation on some of the Farm Bill provisions and all of them that they're looking to be able to do. So I think now is a very good time that now that we're a week out of everyone's being back at the department, to start to reach out to the folks you know there. To start to talk about the importance of tribal consultation. We're looking at developing, I think, a letter to send to USDA about the importance of tribal consultation and doing that and offering support for it. So there's the Office of Tribal Relations and Diane Kulo, who's there, who's the director, who can be reached out to. But don't also forget some of the other agencies as well, too, that includes the folks at NRCS, too, that are very interested in being able to do this as well. one of the things we heard earlier this week is that USDA Deputy Secretary Mike Sinsky is leading the agencies, as they're calling it, FBIT, which is modeled after Fitbit, effort, which is their Farm Bill Implementation Work Group. So they're looking to seat that together and to start doing that. And I think all of the different agencies will be represented within that. So they'll be leading some of the outreach, as they're calling it, charge on that. And I think consultation should be included in that as well, too. Those things are all important. The Tribal Advisory Council is an important thing to consider within this as well. And then also, again, the appropriations questions, and we answered this before when Joe asked it, again, about getting the $5 million appropriation. Otherwise, for the DIPR 638 program, it won't happen. The Native Farm Bill Coalition is really excited for all the support from the tribal leaders and tribal organizations that have been involved, and is very excited to take this next step into implementation. And so this is something that we're going to continue to do and continue to put out resources on and develop it out, because there is this need to have this consistent touch point with the agency as it goes forward to ensure this. So the Native Farm Bill Coalition, ourselves at Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative, as the research partner in this, are here to continue to try to keep providing information, support, outreach, webinars, hard documents, templates, letters, as this goes forward. And so, please keep in mind that this is something that we're going to continue to ramp up. So the Native Farm Bill Coalition is going to continue to grow and build off of the great success within this 2018 Farm Bill. I think a good example of that is currently what's going on right now with a proposed rule at USDA. I'll pass it to Erin to talk about that.
Sure. Thank you, Colby. So just briefly, this isn't actually a rule that's being made under the Farm Bill implementation. This is a separate agency process that started last year in February of 2018. This is the ABODS rule. You may have hear it called that. What that stands for is able-bodied adults without dependents. So basically the way that SNAP, or the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, formerly known as food stamps, works, for folks who are able-bodied and have no dependents, they're required to work at least 80 hours a month or have volunteer work or something that meets their specific definitions about that work. They have to meet 80 hours, or they're only allowed to use the SNAP program for 3 months out of every 36 months. And that's the rule that's been in place since 1996. So this is an older rule that's been around for a while, but the part of the rule that USDA is looking at changing is a waiver process. So basically right now, since 1996, states have had the ability to seek waivers of that requirement from USDA. So, and states use these particularly in times when unemployment is particularly high, when we have areas within a state that are seeing a lot of high unemployment numbers, where there are too few jobs, where people may have jobs available, but for example, for folks who are working maybe in the restaurant industry or the retail industry, where they're shift-based employees, maybe they're working, but they're not able to get enough shifts to meet the requirement, and they still need that assistance to help meet their nutritional needs every month. So that's kind of the justification since 1996 for the waiver process. USDA is looking at changing that waiver process and really limiting the ability of states to seek those waivers and actually put those waivers into place. By the department's own estimate, this proposed change in the rule would remove about 755,000 people from the SNAP program. One of the things that we know from looking at the American Community Survey data from the population census is that 25% of all American Indian and Alaska Native people in the United States today rely on some form of federal food assistance every month to help make sure that their families and themselves are fed. A large percentage of those folks are utilizing the SNAP program. I can't tell you exactly how many people of those 755,000 projected people leaving SNAP that this rule is implemented would be American Indian or Alaska Native, but just based on the 25% of the entire American Indian Alaska Native population using food assistance, I imagine the number would be significant. Again, as I mentioned, this rule has been kind of in movement even before the Farm Bill was passed. The USDA released what's called an advance notice of rulemaking in February of 2018 with some questions that they had about ABODS and changing this waiver process. They solicited comments on that. At the time, in that ANPRM, as it's called, They said that there was no need to do any tribal consultation, that they'd done an analysis under Executive Order 13175 and determined that there were no tribal implications for the proposed rule, so they weren't going to do any tribal consultation on it. The rule has been proposed finally, officially now on February 1st, with the slide notes. And in this published rule and the proposed rule, curiously, they've changed their position. They say it does require tribal consultation. They note that tribal consultation was done in March of 2018, and they did not receive any comments. Their stated position in February was that tribal consultation wasn't required. Apparently, they said they did tribal consultation anyway on one of the quarterly teleconference calls that USDA FMS holds that cover all of the nutrition programs. They said they didn't receive any comments there, but if tribal leadership has thoughts or comments on this, there is an opportunity coming up next week, a week from tomorrow on Valentine's Day, February 14th, if you've got tribal leadership at the National Congress of American Indians Executive Winter Session, there's a listening session with USDA from 9 to 10 a.m. in the New York room at the Capitol Hilton, and that will be covering this proposed ABOG rule. We are working on a comment template. If you've been following this rule at all, you may have seen other organizations put out some comment templates. I think Feeding America, FRAP, and a couple of other organizations have one. We're developing one specifically for Indian country and tribal leadership. So keep an eye out for the coalition's draft comments template. That should be coming out soon. And really, just on a side note before I close out, like one of the reasons that we felt when the proposed rule or the advance notice of rulemaking was issued in 2018, one of the reasons we felt like this would have tribal implications that required consultation is that anytime policy changes are made to the SNAP program, we see an impact on FDIPR immediately, usually the next month. SNAP and FDIPR are billed as alternatives to each other for people in Indian country who need food assistance. You can't be on both programs in the same month, same time. You have to choose between one or the other, and people make the best decisions that they can make to help make sure that they're feeding their families every month. When SNAP benefits are lowered, we see people immediately trying to go over to FDIPR. We've seen that since the government shutdown with all of the uncertainty around SNAP. A lot of our FDIPR sites, we're seeing people come there to try to figure out how they could be decertified from SNAP and get onto FDIPR instead, because they felt like that was a better alternative that was more stable, that would allow them to use that program to meet their needs for the month. So I would anticipate if this policy change does go into effect, that we would see more folks showing up to try to help feed their families through FDIPR. Unfortunately, that won't come with any increased funding for FDIPR, so FDIPR will have to do more with less, essentially. So there will definitely be, to me, tribal implications for this change in the rule, and that's why we're working on the comments template for the coalition to put that out there into the world. Those comments are going to be due by April 2nd. There's a time clock that ticks of 60 days once the rule is published. You have 60 days to comment on it. So comments will be due in, you can submit online through the Federal Register. Those are due by April 2nd. I will say, if the government does not continue to be operational past next week, I don't really know if that's going to toll the time clock or not. Previously, like a draft of this rule was released before the government shut down in December. It wasn't officially published in the Federal Register, though, so the clock didn't start ticking for comment. Not sure that would actually be the case. The Federal Register continued to operate during the shutdown. It had a brief hiccup, but then it got back online. So I think as long as the Federal Register is up and running, then we should assume that comments will be due by April 2nd, even if the government shuts down again. So that's a little bit about the ABOG rule.
Thank you, Erin. Yeah, so the target date is April 2nd, and there will be a Native Farm Bill Coalition template out shortly on that to help provide a mechanism for commenting on it. Just to sort of close out, for folks we have a lot of folks that joined this, so thank you all for joining and staying on for the nearly 90 minutes of this discussion. If your tribe or tribal organization or a partner organization hasn't joined the Native Farm Bill Coalition yet, please do so, because we're still in that critical component to be able to make sure the implementation happens, looking at some of the changes which maybe we didn't get in this Farm Bill but could be included in the next one. There might be some opportunities in the child nutrition reauthorization, which comes up usually after the Farm Bill, after the Ag committees take a little bit of a breather. But that includes school lunch programs, WIC, and those type of programs as well too. So you can go to nativefarmbillcoalition.org, which has a lot of this information on it. You can also email info@nativefarmbillcoalition.org too. This also includes a draft resolution template to be able to be a part and join this effort. So if you haven't done so already, please consider doing so. And I think just with that, I just want to be able to say thank you to all the folks that were involved in this effort, particularly the Shakopee, Metawakan, and Sioux community for their support in really developing and setting up the Native Farm Bill Coalition, being able to help provide a place for this type of sharing and information and providing the leadership and strength for it. Also, our partner organizations in this, the Intertribal Agriculture Council, the National Congress of American Indians, our Intertribal Timber Council, all of the 76 individual tribes that have joined, and the 14 tribal organizations as well. And I think thank you to all the folks that have consistently joined and offered efforts and questions in this as well too. We'll continue to be able to put out different comments as we can in this effort. But I think right now we're in that really critical phase of trying to be able to make sure that the implementation goes forward. So with that, the last thing I want to do is thank our staff here at IFAI, Aaron Parker, Blake Jackson, and Whitney Swanee for all their work being able to do this as well, including Tony Stanger McLaughlin, who couldn't join us today, but did a lot of work to be able to help support this as well. Us at IFAI are continue to be a resource in all the different aspects of work that we go into, and also helping to support the work of the Native Farm Bill Coalition. So with that, I'll leave my contact information up there as well too, so you just don't have a general email to go to as well. You can visit our website at indigenousfoodandag.com and check some of that. Check out the information that we have on there too. But with that, just want to say thank you to everyone that joined here for all of your time today. We will be able to have this webinar posted on our YouTube channel to watch through later, and send out the materials that we have available for, and the copies of the slides as well, so you'll have those as well. But with that, thank you all very much, and have a great afternoon.